Hello there. The EU has now laid a load of its cards on the table, and it does not bode well for the finances of its citizens. Now, if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe, click the little bell, select all, and then like and comment below. Early Sunday morning, EU negotiators proudly proclaimed they had agreed to upgrade their Carbon Emissions Trading Scheme, or ETS, and agreed the creation of a social climate fund. And all the revenue raised by the updated EU carbon market will be spent on climate action, whatever that is. But what this includes is a new extra tax for the citizenry to pay as part of the ETS 2. And that was seen to be the most politically risky part of this whole deal. More on that potentially explosive policy in a moment. And something the people of the UK need to be aware of, because you can bet your bottom dollar some sort of matching policy is almost certainly brewing in the bowels of Westminster. But first, the EU Emissions Trading Scheme is being updated to drive down carbon emissions by the EU. But this will now also include imported goods. Currently, the EU and UK ETS systems tax polluters operating within their jurisdictions. But one drawback is when cheaper goods can be imported from heavier polluting countries. And the EU system will in future address this. If the imported goods cannot be proved to have matched EU standards on carbon emissions when being produced in their own countries, they will be charged a carbon tax at the EU border. And these rules will apply first to iron and steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity production and hydrogen. Yes, and hydrogen, before being further extended to include other goods. This is to prevent EU industries offshoring carbon-heavy parts of their production process while pretending to be green, something referred to as carbon leakage. The idea is that importers will have to buy certificates to cover the emissions created by the production of imported goods, all linked to the EU's carbon pricing, all to prevent carbon dirty goods from undercutting clean EU goods. The level playing field, as it were. So anyone wanting to export into the EU will have to prove their emissions are equal to or lower than the EU standards or face a tariff. It will also have a protectionist angle to it, as it will encourage EU industry to keep its production in-house. But already US and African countries are concerned about the impact this will have on their manufacturers, and there are also trading relationships to consider. This will arguably increase the cost of goods for the average EU citizen, i.e. it will fuel inflation. With the Greens being more than happy about this, because the rising costs will push down consumption and so save the planet. But there is another angle to this updated EU carbon policy, and that is ETS 2. This is where the citizens get taxed directly on their carbon footprint. Yes, it started. As of 2027, EU citizens will pay a carbon tax on their road fuel and heating costs. And at today's rates, that will add 10.5 cents to a litre of petrol and 12 cents to a litre of diesel, says the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change. This can only be viewed as an extra tax on the people, just like increasing VAT rates. And any of these carbon costs incurred by the state will, of course, be paid for by the long-suffering taxpayer. And some EU lawmakers are worried that this could spark unrest and start an EU-wide version of the French Yellow Vest movement. So what they've also agreed to do is create a huge €87 billion social climate fund, paid for via the carbon taxes raised, that can be used to offset the costs for the most vulnerable people and micro enterprises for a few years until the system is bedded in. They've also set a temporary cap of €45 per tonne of carbon. But as the average Westerner uses about 10 tonnes a year, one supposes that somehow €450 will be extracted from every EU citizen every year. Now, back in June 2021, when this plan was first mooted, French MEP Pascal Canfin called it a politically suicidal policy. Do not make the mistake of extending the carbon market to heating and fuel. We experienced it in France. It gave us the yellow vests, he said. But the Eurocrats don't seem too bothered about the concerns and antics of their little citizens, do they? They are pressing ahead with these plans regardless. They are presumably relying on giving the poorest some extra money from the Social Climate Fund as a sweetener, a way of placating them and stopping them donning a dreaded yellow vest. And if some do, the Eurocrats probably think that a little unrest can be dealt with and is a price worth paying. Oh, and the concept of an EU climate fund, once accepted, could become a net contributor into any new global climate reparations fund, couldn't it? Could become or will become. Anyway, that's all in the EU and doesn't concern us, and in fact we should keep our noses out of it, so we can put down not having to pay a citizen's carbon tax as a Brexit benefit, can't we? Yeah. So you think these machinations aren't going on behind closed doors in the EU-loving offices of the faceless mandarins in Westminster? After all, they do like to keep the UK as closely aligned to the EU as they can, don't they? Now, these ETS talks have been going on in the EU for several years now, so our civil service and politicians will have been well aware of where this is going. They are also singing from the exact same WEF Net Zero Great Reset hymn sheet that the Eurocrats are. And just to give it a nudge in the right direction, ClimateSelectra.com said last year that research carried out by environmental campaigners Zero Carbon found widespread support for the introduction of a UK carbon tax. In a poll involving 2,000 people ahead of the COP26 summit earlier this month, 2/3 said the introduction of a carbon tax would be a fair way to raise money. Almost 7 in 10 respondents, 68%, said poorer people should be protected from the impact of a carbon tax. Sounds very similar to the EU system, doesn't it? Now, as I understand it, the UK government did consult on a wider carbon tax, and Grant Thornton says, the UK government also recently consulted on introducing a more wide-ranging carbon emissions tax, which was rejected at that time. And I think you'll find that the term "at that time" will in future prove to be the important bit, because the government has hinted at the future widening in scope of carbon taxes in the UK. Sounds like a WEF lockstep to me. Now, humans need carbon to live, and we need to emit carbon in one way or another to get on in life. So these citizen-based carbon taxes will be permanent. It will be an added burden. It will remove purchasing power from the worker and hand more money to government and into the pockets of their corporate chums to combat climate change. Net zero carbon will be a net negative drain on the wallets of every EU citizen. And if the Westminster blob has its way, it will be dumped on us here too. And if the Tories can't be made to do it, then Labour will almost certainly be quite happy to do so. Now, as I've pointed out before, the UN wants everyone on the planet to emit no more than 2 tonnes of carbon a year. Based on our current Western level of about 10 tonnes a year, a reduction to 2 tonnes would reduce us to a very basic and subsistence level of existence. Travel would be out. Carbon-heavy food would be out. Personal transport would be out. Single-room occupancy would be in, as would sharing and renting just about everything else. And personal advancement would be planet-destroying and therefore frowned upon. You will know thy place. You will own nothing, and no one will care if that makes you unhappy. While the great and good fly about the world from one sumptuous event to another, berating the rest of us on how climate evil we are. And finally, when subscribing, please don't forget to press that little bell and also select the all option, or you won't get any notifications when I publish a new video. And thank you all so much for taking the time to watch the show.